Welcome to Seeing This. I'm Mike Ornelas, and today I'm very intrigued and delighted to be joined by writer, director, producer, artist Angelo Madsen, whose documentary, A Body to Live In, explores the world of BDSM performance art and body play with a focus on the transgressive artist Farik Musafar, who experimented with and built a community around piercings and tattoos with lasting impacts that we see even today. Angelo, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Of course, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you.
There's so many layers to your documentary, and it's truly quite fascinating. When did you first learn about Farik, and at what point did you decide to dedicate a film focusing on his life, BDSM performance art, and what about him led you to want to focus your energy on this project?
Yeah, I'll just say his name is Fakir. Fakir
Fakir,
Musafar.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. That's okay. Yeah, uncommon name, which he actually chose for himself as a collage of Sufi mysticism and some other ideas which inform his practice. I first found out about his work. I had seen an issue of the Modern Primitives Research publication in the early 2000s, maybe like 2002. And there was a lot of publications going around that time if you were kind of interested in punk culture, underground stuff, queer stuff, anarchist stuff, kink stuff, arty, underground art stuff. Um, it was a pretty rich subculture still then. And research publications was sort of at the foreground of that. They came out with Search and Destroy magazine, which was a punk magazine in the 90s, or maybe before then, even 80s. And so long legacy of kind of just putting out countercultural material. When they started doing the bigger publication issues, those were all over the place. So like there was the Bob Flanagan book, there was Industrial Culture Handbook, there was Angry Women, there's the Annie Sprinkle book, Performance Artist book. Um, and I found out about the work that way. I met him a couple years later. I was collaborating with someone who was working with Cleo at these erotic dominance workshops, intensives she was teaching in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. And so I actually got to know Cleo before I even met Fakir. Um, and then I met her through him, and I didn't really put together that he was a modern primitives guy, but until a little later. But I did see his monograph, Spirit Plus Flesh, a little bit later, maybe 2004 or five. And that was the only kind of monograph of his photography that was ever released. And I was really taken with the images. Really, really gorgeous photographs, and particularly the photographs that were self-portraits, were really, really rich and compelling to me. And so, I was collaborating with in these like erotic dominance intensive workshop environments and with, you know, queer kink community in Chicago where I was living at the time, going back and forth. And I was in art school also. And so, I mean, those things are pretty like direct correlation. More abstractly, in terms of things I'm interested in, almost all of my work is driven by some kind of like interest in figuring out how people structure belief systems in their lives, and how people make meaning from belief systems, uh, and their own relationships. So their own kind of like fantasy structures, belief systems, but then they're also the way they believe in the humans in their lives. And so a lot of my films are about these kinds of relationships that untangle from very messy angles. I like messy angles. So yeah, I started working on the film. I mean, I was involved with BLW for a window of time and some other organizations that we were overlapping in. I didn't start working on the film until his cancer diagnosis in 2018. And then it was kind of late in the game, and so um, real research on the film didn't start until 2019. And so he
Wow.
passed away a few months before we really kind of dove into things. Um, yeah, and then I just made the film between 2019 and it released in 2005 at True Falls Film Festival.
A lot of the imagery is quite engulfing and definitely captures your attention. And I'm curious because your documentary consists of mostly archival footage and it's quite
Yeah.
captivating in itself. Can you speak to how you go about writing this documentary, constructing it, do you already
Yeah,
have a point A to point B in mind for the storyline, or is that something that you
yeah.
discover through the edit?
Both and with this film, I had certain sets of issues that are of most interest to me. So, firstly, this is not comprehensive, in any way, shape, or form. Like, if you want a comprehensive survey of the history of body piercing, you'd have to read like someone's 800-page dissertation, which hasn't really been written yet. Like this has not gotten this corner of counterculture has not gotten its academic attention yet, shall we say.
Mm,
I mean, there's a few people. I shouldn't say that. Like Matt Lauder in the UK, Amber Gillian Muster in the US, um, Amelia Jones, Andy Campbell. There's some people that are talking about this stuff. But in terms of the actual survey and the history of body piercing, it's not a super, hotbed academic topic. But in terms of arranging archival materials, I had to come in with my set of interests, and for me, given my interests that are already in place about community, relationships, world building situations, I was really invested in how body modification as a movement was dovetailing with the grief culture of AIDS and HIV
mm,
in the 90s. And so, and Fakir's own death, and thinking about this sort of pipeline or a growth pattern biography of someone's life as and body modification as preparation for death, as a sort of grief process.
mm,
And so that's an idea that sort of guided a lot of my choices with the film. Of course, super interested in the photography and the performance art because those are also close to me. Um, but, for example, there's very little information about contemporary suspension culture because that's not one of my areas of interest.
sure.
So, like, there's a lot of, like, suspenders that are like, why didn't you talk more about suspension? I was like, I don't really care about suspension. It's interesting for sure, but I'm interested in all these things as they intersect with these other fields of interest. And so in terms of having those predefined sets of interests, I definitely tailor my research to those sets of interests. The relationships that build, the way communities and subcultures are sort of like intersecting and diverging from each other this whole time, is guiding the research. But I also look for visual coherency, visual juxtaposition. So, like, if I see an image that I feel really attracted to and I don't know why, I'm definitely going to flag it. I don't need to know why I'm attracted to it. Doesn't matter.
Mm.
I'm sure I'll be able to, like, if it's really, really pulling at me, I'll be able to get it in there somehow. And I did that with plenty of images where I can kind of just construct narrative around them because they really are still images. And the film is really, guided by this, like, vocal cacophony, a chorus, if you will, of these elders that are all kind of sharing stories together. And that opens up a lot of space for the images to become narrative in a way they maybe aren't intentionally narrative or intended to be, but can be when juxtaposed with something else.
You say it's not comprehensive, which that may be true, but you do cover a lot of ground as far as the decades you cover and the different kind of corners or pockets of this performance art or spiritual therapy, even if you will. And I found it
Yeah.
riveting to learn about Gauntlet that opened in the 70s and essentially offered piercings to people anywhere that they pleased on their body.
Yeah.
Based on this process of research or even your own experiences, how would you say that the BDSM performance art or body play has evolved over the years and to the point of how it's practiced today?
I think it's really hard to talk about that because there's so many different niches of this work. There's the kind that happens in museums and galleries. They're the kinds that happens in clubs as demonstrations, and and then there's the kinds that cross pollinate. And I think that not every performance work that happens in a club or part of kink community is for a broader audience. You know, and some is, and some is being conceptualized within the discourse of performance art and therefore somehow maybe more appropriate for a museum or gallery environment, and like some is not being contextualized within the discourse of performance art. And sometimes that's makes it better. It's like it's not involved with the discourse, it's on its own terms. I think there's tons of people making this kind of work today that are functioning on their own terms. um, and so, I mean, I don't know. I just like we have great kink orgs in New York City, and um, you know, I just saw great performance events over the summer where there was a bunch of queer kinksters doing, like durational performance work. a la Ron Athey, like a la Bob Flanagan. Like, I think there's really direct pipelines that are still super active.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point because there's, when I lived in San Francisco for some time and when, kink.com was operating out of the Armory there in San Francisco, got to do a tour there. And it's just all these different kind of again, like the spectrum of the art. And I love the juxtaposition you have in the film of it being, when this is done in like a quote unquote circus like setting, that it's more
Yeah.
socially acceptable. But if it happens, in the privacy of one's home or a club, it can be considered immoral or corrupt. What would you say is the biggest misconception of the practice that people from the outside just get wrong?
I think the biggest misconception is that there's some sort of like idea or framework around like what it means to be like hardcore,
Mm,
you know?
mm,
Um, and part of what the film does that circumvents that is that it really kind of like draws out the tenderness and the way that relationships are really cultivated over time. People don't just one day wake up and decide to put hooks in their back, and like hang from them. That's just not how it works. And so, and not only that, but like the process of then identifying someone who has the sanity, the safety, the skill sets to be able to engage that kind of practice, and then figuring out what your body needs to actually be able to then sustain that kind of practice. Like these are really slow
mm.
processes that take deep consideration. Part of what we love about the image of BDSM is that hardcore-ness, right? Like that's imagery, that's iconography. It's not it's not an instructional how-to, right? Seeing some like hardcore sex scene or whatever on porn is not a how-to. In the same way that like, watching an episode of Law and Order with a, like
Sure.
whatever, like this shit is
Right.
not like movies and TV and culture are not a how to. So trying to kind of soften that in a way to invite people into some of the tenderizing parts of this work. And thinking about it as an extension of any other myriad kinds of body practices people engage in that break their bodies down to rebuild something new. So, like, yes, there's injury involved with this. There's also overcoming injury involved with this, which is what weightlifters do. It's what long distance
Right.
runners do. It's what people who meditate do. So, trying to sort of like just destigmatize this a little bit to be like, how is this actually that different? Yeah, but then also just like foregrounding how much true intimacy and trust you need with someone to be able to engage this. Like, this is really like people who want to play with limitations of emotional capacity, intellectual capacity, physical capacity. Like, this is an incredible pipeline to those things.
And I really appreciate that you mentioned, not just now, but in the documentary about community and the intimacy of it and the trust. And also that you include the perspective of the American Indians or the native tribes, considering that it is like a healing ritual aspect. I'd just love to get your thoughts around the idea of being inspired by global cultural traditions versus being considered a form of appropriation or misrepresentation, which can ultimately lead to walking that fine line of it being considered, even cultish. Anything that kind of has a spiritual shell around it can get
Yeah.
that stigma. I just love your thoughts about that kind of philosophy and that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super hard because like everything comes from somewhere, right?
Hmm.
Like nothing is we don't make anything up. Everything comes from somewhere. Someone else did it before us. And it's a human precondition to want to have some sort of connection with other. Um and I don't mean other like, in, indigeneity. I mean other like higher power, right?
Right.
So like there's these natural human drives to want those things. And so I think it's dangerous to demonize the desire for those kinds of things, but I think it's also dangerous to not have a sense of critical reflection of positioning, and where you're coming from. And I think during the time he was discovering these things, like people were not thinking about their positionalities in the world yet. And I think he was, made a lot of like bad decisions, said a lot of dumb shit,
Mm.
and really upset a lot of people. And I think he was also a very rigid thinker, you know? And so, at the time when he was being challenged on a lot of these ideas in the 80s, when he like blew up, right? So like essentially this shit happened kind of overnight. Like he was living in secret for so long, doing these things in secret for so long, having such fetishistic desire, but also so ambitious, so driven, and so profoundly producing, like just so prolific, making so much work and giving so much energy to this. And then as soon as it blew up and he was like, I can share this with people now, it was like slam. Um, and so I think he was just like busted by it. I think he was
Mm,
kind of broken by it and couldn't really recover from it. And I think that's why he sort of developed this kind of spiel that he does. He also dug his heels in
right.
to the discourse of like this comes from someplace else, and that made it worse. Like he thought he was like, he thought he was kind of like doing the right thing by being like, I want to make sure people know like this comes from like the Taipei sound tradition in Southeast Asia, or this comes from indigenous American Indian traditions, or this comes from Sufi mysticism, or this comes from paganism, or what. He was very like trying to point to these things as if that was, um, you know, the balm or the salve to the wound, when that really just aggravated it was salt on the wounds
Mm,
because it didn't actually address the entitlement
right,
around it,
right,
right? So like
right, right,
it addressed the historicity from a white perspective
right.
on his terms, and then it didn't actually address the entitlement to the practices and to be able to call them what they're called by these people. So it's kind of an interesting kind of clusterfuck in some ways, and also like I try really hard to like not absolve him from this behavior,
Hmm.
but also to like hold all of the different kinds of monstrosity together. And I think about like gender in that same bag. Like, not, at this point in time, like we have a really strong kind of like trans queer community that are seeing themselves reflected in all these different ways. But if I think about it, like if people were watching this in the 1940s, the monstrosity would not be the Sundance. The monstrosity would be the freak in a corset and high heels.
Yeah, right.
And so I try to just like shift my thoughts about history a little bit, like not to apologize or forego, but to like position like what would have been the sort of like cultural window people were looking through. Um, and he was born in 1930, so like he's literally like a depression baby,
Hmm.
like in South Dakota in a little tiny town. Um, and he brings that kind of era. It's like pre-boomer or whatever. He's bringing this like this sense of entitlement to almost everything he does. That's also what makes him a really good figure, right? Like to be a leader of sorts, you have to feel entitled to do these things. Otherwise, you don't do them.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you mentioned that he kind of dug in his heels, because as I was watching the film, I'm very open minded. I personally haven't taken part in any of the BDSM performance aspect, but I can understand one's desire or interest or intrigue or development to get into that world. But as it proceeds, you kind of learn where he gets too big for his britches, if you will. But there is a moment where you kind of feel, like I was mentioning, cultish because of like him standing firm and not really being flexible as far as like his beliefs and his mission, if you will. And I think the documentary does a good job of highlighting that. There's not really a lot of judgment one way or the other as far as how the audience should feel about him. And as you mentioned, a lot of your films, the majority, if not all of your films over the past decade, do touch on subculture and at times aspects of taboo. What do you think it is specifically, outside of the community you mentioned, like that really drives you to want to make films about this, to kind of highlight areas that a lot of people might not be familiar with?
I think part of it is just like curiosity.
Mm,
And like it's curiosity is so sort of demonized these days, like you're only allowed to be curious about things that like you're part of. Um, and I get away with this shit because I'm part of it, but also I'm just interested in it.
sure.
I'm interested in like why we gravitate towards the ideas we gravitate towards. Um, I'm also like always wanting to craft some sort of like affective experience. So if I can like offer a sort of trip, like I don't want to say a journey because that's a little bit too narrative for me, but
Mm,
like a trip, like a day trip, like starting somewhere, going somewhere else. And I want you to have big feelings while you're in the car,
yeah, yeah.
Um, that's what's exciting to me about the form, about cinema itself. Is this capacity for having an emotional landscape beyond yourself. I try not to think of my work as too representative or comprehensive, of subculture because there's so much that I'm playing with and teasing out that is of specific interest to me that couldn't really be spoken for in large picture.
Totally makes sense. I mean, the film itself, that it feels like a ride. Like you're going on this
Yeah.
journey and kind of learning of this new landscape, or at least, new to many, in a very informative way. But as I mentioned, not any kind of judgmental or
Yeah.
shape how you're supposed to feel about it. I'm curious, do you remember the first artist or piece of art that really caught your attention and helped shape the type of art you produce, the type of artist you are today?
I'm thinking of something that's a really bad example. So let me talk a little bit that I can think of something better.
Okay.
But one of the things I was thinking about after I finished that thing I just said was that part of what I want to do too is that like I'm really interested in like posing lots of questions in conversation, like creating a web of questions that are sort of in conversation with each other, but I don't necessarily want to give you any answers.
Mm,
And I think that's part of the reason I veer um towards towards objectivity a little bit. Like I know it's impossible when you're an artist or a maker of culture in any capacity, it's impossible to be objective. We know this from the ethics of documentary, blah blah blah. Objectivity is a myth, blah blah blah. But I think there's still something valuable in trying to just hold as much suspension of judgment as possible. Like trying to suspend notions at all possible corners is like a really, really valuable thing to do. Um, and so I think that's where I come from with most of the work in terms of like just wanting there to be like nuance and like characters. I like characters.
mhm,
I like people to feel really complicated, like they are, which is a huge challenge to do in a film because the nature of it is obviously reductive and extractive. So how do you then, considering the limitations of reductivity and construct like extractions, how do you then craft something that feels really holistic in the face of the form? Um, you know, artist stuff. I saw a ton of art as a kid. I was a kind of art kid. Um, I think in terms of things that really made me think differently about what was possible, there were two things
mm,
um, that happened around the same time. And the first one was I read Naked Lunch, which um, I which blew my mind in a
sure,
million pieces. I for a brief window it was masturbatory material at that
sure,
age.
sure.
And I was just like, this is insane. This is insane. This is insane. Someone is like being hung and then turns into a cockroach and then is having their butthole washed out. And then, you know what I mean? I
Yeah,
was like a 14-year-old exploding. And also having really big feelings about the fact that I was exploding about this. Like, oh my
yeah.
God, what's wrong? What is wrong with me that like this is what's getting me going. And so I don't know. I feel like those early experiences with art are also wrapped up in thoughts about the body, thoughts about ontogeny and growth and human transformation processes. The other thing I saw around that same time, a couple years later, was Multiple Maniacs, John Waters' first film. And I was friends with these two dykes. One was 22, and we would hang out at her apartment after school, and she would bring home videos from the video store and
Mm,
beer. And we would drink beer and watch video store movies. And we watched Multiple Maniacs, we watched Nowhere, Greg Rocky's Nowhere, and then we watched Doom Generation. Um, and Better Than Chocolate. A lot of the new queer cinema that was coming out then, Delta, Iris X Delta, Go Fish, Watermelon. Just like a lot of this like really underground new queer cinema that you could get at the fucking video store
sure.
because the market was so not saturated in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, those are the early things I remember.
I love that you kind of answered my last question that I like to ask everyone. But maybe you have another one in mind. I'm always curious, what is a underseen film that you would recommend for people to check out and put on their radar, whether it is correlated to your documentary, maybe another documentary, or something just not on people's radar that you would suggest for people to catch?
Yeah, I got one for you. It's a film called Ruckus.
Okay.
It's by a filmmaker named Brett Hanover. They live in Memphis, Tennessee. And I honestly think that this is so stupid, but like maybe part of the reason why their work is underseen is because they're just like not super present in the New York, LA shit that people are looking at. Um, but they made a film called Ruckus, which sort of a loose, like, I don't know, hybrid documentary, part scripted, part documentary about furry community, and their own sort of like finding furry community, growing up in the South in Memphis in like punk houses and like counterculture movements and like finding furry stuff and like their relationship with this furry person they meet at a con in like Florida or some shit, and the friendship that evolves and then that person's subsequent suicide.
Oh, wow.
And it's really intense and beautiful and funny and weird. And there's like reenactments that are just like beautiful and weird. Um, in terms of thinking about like editing as a sort of weeding practice, I think that film is a really beautiful example of a editing as a weeding practice.
You've been very gracious with your
Thanks, Mike.
time. I could keep going down this rabbit hole that the film opens. We didn't even touch on pubic hair love letters, the catacombs of SF, the spiritual healing impact of a woman getting her hood re-pierced. There's just so
Yeah,
much that this documentary has. So again, congratulations on the film. The film is A
thanks, Mike.
Body to Live In. It is available for DVD and Blu-ray pre-order now, and will be available for digital later this month, May 2026. If you want more info on Angelo, you can go to angelomadsen.com, or the film, you can go to abodytolivein.com. Angelo Madsen, thank you so much, and best of luck with everything moving forward.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate talking to you. Thanks for taking the time.